Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to the Woo Curious podcast. Your map to the mystical, your key to the sacred, and your guide back home to yourself. I'm Eileen, a writer, a spiritual coach, energy healer, and slow living witch. This podcast is your invitation to explore a world where the mundane and the sacred intertwine. It's a haven for those ready to take the first steps into the realms of magic and mystery, providing a safe space for you to embark on your own enchanted journey towards healing and self-discovery. Here, I'll unveil the whispers of the mystical, the rituals often hidden in plain sight, and I'll engage in sacred conversation intended to stir your soul and lead you back into your power. I'm all about demystifying woo and witchcraft. So, whether you're a seasoned seeker or simply woo curious, I'm so delighted you've decided to join me on this journey. Let's make magic. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Woo Curious podcast. I am your host, Eileen, and I am so delighted to be here today with another guest. Today, I am joined by Espen Artio, who is a queer priestess and embodied ecological witch. They are a spiritual mentor to fierce and tender-hearted seekers and offer a range of different services, including folk healing sessions, readings, plant circles, and witchcraft mentorship, and more. Located in the Pacific Northwest, Salish territories. I couldn't be happier to have you here today speaking with me, Espen. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I know these synchronicities of meeting people online. We were chatting before we hopped on. It's magic. It's really cool that we get to form friendships and acquaintanceships and relationships with people who otherwise might never have landed in our spheres.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's like I always think about how I will be real. Technology is not always like it's not my biggest skill set, but I'm always like, this is so incredibly magical that we're like through time and space, like you're on another continent and we're here to like talk and interact. It's really such a blessing. It's really cool.
Yeah, for sure. Us witches tend to like the moss and the grass under our feet real time, but there is something beautiful about what this technology allows us, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to start today chatting a little bit about you and the work you do and your story about how you ended up here, what led you here.
Gosh, what a long journey. It's like always such a funny thing to reflect and be like, yeah, like what did lead me here? So many different pieces, right? Like I think in part, a lot of my craft and my perspective with spirituality broadly and magic and all of that is very rooted in the land. I've always loved the plants. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and it's very green. And I, as a little one, just like had such an affinity for the herbs in the garden and like would make little concoctions. And my siblings had moved out of the home. So I was kind of raised as an only child and I was alone outside all the time. And so I think like that just like being in conversation with the plants and like the soil and the creatures like really informed my practice as I got older. I just kept that sense of communication going and began to place it within this other context of more of like a spiritual kind of conversation. But, I was raised very, very strict Catholic and also experienced a lot of like harm in my household and there was a lot of abuse. And so I was like very, very religious. And as a teen, coming out as like a queer teen, just in my own heart, like really went through a big rebellion phase. And I pushed away the church and started getting into like anything I could get my hands on. And like that history just like really informed my history of both like the church and like abuse and also this like rebellious teenage seeking, I think like really marked my journey and path because I was like so interested in healing and wanted to heal and pulled in information from a million different kinds of sources and learned from so many teachers and traveled all over the world and learned from many different folks and read a ton. And it all kind of started to weave itself into this pattern where it kept coming back to this like healing through the land and healing through land-based spirituality and herbal medicine. And I got really into herbal medicine, and my own like personal healing journey just kept dovetailing with my spirit work. And eventually, I found a really beautiful like space in the greater Seattle area with like queer and trans radical witches. And I felt like I really experienced such a homecoming and a way of like weaving a larger container around everything I'd learned for years, which kind of I would name as like ancestral craft. And I started to like really, my head really deepened in like being very politicized and having a very radical perspective and like really rooting into like anti-oppressive frameworks. And I really wanted my magic to serve and reflect that. And it all just like the concept of ancestral work really fit and helped me hold these pieces of like healing these wounds from family and lineage, and also rooting into the land and seeing the land and the elements as ancestors. And also like, what does that mean to serve community and see myself as like this archetype of the witch that is in service to supporting and liberating ourselves and others. And so that's kind of like where my work has really grown out of and come from, is like all those like disparate pieces coming together,
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. I love always hearing about how people found their way to this work, and there's often some very similar threads. One of them
Totally.
being that healing, our own personal healing journey, leading to this deep realization that we can help others, and almost a calling to do so. And I love that for you, it was very connected with the land, because that mirrors my own journey in a lot of ways. When you're talking about being a kid and just feeling like you're connecting, I remember in grade 3 doing a project on the rainforest, which I had never been, but coming home to my mother just in tears because I could not believe that this much forest was being cut down every day. And I had this like deep sense of, well, this can't go on. The adults have to stop this. They see how terrible it is. And having that kind of response throughout my life to the ecological disasters that happen around us has been a real strong thread in my life.
Mm.
And when I turned to witchcraft, I wasn't even calling it that at that point, but I was a midwife for 6 years. So I feel like it's not a stretch to then be calling myself a witch. But what I started with was holding these Wheel of the Year ceremonies, which really for me and for those the lineage of it, the history of it, is that rooting back into land and harmonizing our bodies with the cycles of nature and reconnecting to those energies and honoring the land that we're on and the stories and the history and the support of that land that lives there.
Mm. It's so beautiful. Like it makes me it makes me emotional just because like it's so just true. Like children intuitively understand. Like I guess I always like feel hopefulness in that these systems like really have to train people into compliance, because like we innately feel we are connected to the land. Like we innately intuitively understand that this is sacred. And like I think those ceremonies of the Wheel of the Year are so healing and important because it helps us just remember that is true. Like it's right there,
Yeah, we are just another animal living on the face of this earth. There is that loss of connection, as you've said, and quite willfully, consciously, not consciously by anybody living today anymore, I don't think, but there was at some point we got this real divide between humans and the rest of the world and the rest of the planet and the more than human world that we are a part of. And it's a topic that fascinates me. Have you read Sophie Strand at all?
Do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
So
figured,
beautiful.
oh, so beautiful. I remember reading The Flowering Wand and just being like, oh my God. Not God, gods, goddesses.
So beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like all those, I mean, right now I'm like also like thinking of all these really beautiful thinkers and writers who have been, yeah, like speaking to this. I do feel this like hopefulness that I think there is this resurgence
Mhm.
in this remembering of remembering, reweaving, also listening. Like these are indigenous life ways. Like, not everyone had lost this awareness, but like, yeah, this like over cultural sense of like we're all machines living in a very like machine oriented world. And I love those kinds of ecological writers. Like I'm also thinking about like David Abram, like Spell of the Sensuous, and
Mm.
like all those pieces of like remembering that this is an animate living world, and we're also not machines. Like you said, like we're just another animal. And
Mhm.
to like have this respect and kinship, yeah, it just makes me feel so emotional.
Me too. I can cry about it. I've told the story a few times of reading Braiding Sweetgrass, and at the end of every chapter, at least at some point in every chapter, I bawled. And there was a couple times when I got right to the end and I was like, oh, I didn't cry. And then the last line would just get me and I would dissolve in tears. But it is that sense of remembering. Very, like for me, it's a sense of coming home to my body and the earth and that connection that exists there. And I think that probably ties in a little bit to what you spoke about or briefly mentioned, that ancestral magic piece. Do you want to speak about what that journey of finding that has been for you, or how that comes up for you in your work?
Totally. Yes. Yeah. I think that's why like the concept of ancestral healing and ancestral magic, ancestral craft, it's like the organizing principle of how I come to understand so much about the world. And that ancestral healing is blood lineage pieces and understanding like patterns that move through me that come from, my family of origin, and the patterns that have moved through the generations and the lineages, both blessings and curses, right? And I think that helps us bring into, as far as like the body level, right? Like it helps me hold space for those like politicized aspects of the craft where I acknowledge like how my body arrived in the space that it's in, and also helps me remember and connect and contact like a very multifaceted stream of energy and blessing and magic and memory, right? That like is so much beyond, like my body is made up of genetic information of peoples that are so much more than just my family of origin. And
Mm-hmm.
so ancestral craft in a kind of paradoxical way helped me work through a lot of my resistance to the concept of family, because it
Mm.
had sort of negative baggage to me. And this helped me be like, I like really, really root into ancestor in that way. And then, there's that piece of this like human lineage piece, which is so huge, but also like inevitably ancestor also leads us into this. I always just think of the phrase like reweaving kinship with other than human
Yeah.
ancestors, like plant and animal ancestors, and the land itself. Also, our bodies are made up of the plants that we eat from the ground on the lands we live, and the water we drink and the air we breathe, and also the same things that our ancestors ate. The land became part of their body, which was passed on to us, even if we never have been on that land, and that sense of connection and communion with beings that are not human, I think is also a really essential part of ancestor work that is just like, because I think kind of back to what you were mentioning about this like very machine oriented kind of paradigm that we live under.
Yeah. This
That like,
capitalistic driven us versus them, like us versus everything else on the world mentality that is just kind of normalized in Western culture, like white Western culture, we'll call it that to give it a nice little, yeah.
yeah, it's like the living earth is like a resource.
Yeah.
And that's how we literally talk about it, you know? And like, rather than what I think, you know, this is expressed so beautifully in Indigenous lifeways, but also I think is deeply human, like for the vast majority of our history, like humans looked at animals and plants and elements and planets as literal ancestors. And I feel like in my own life and with so many people I work with, there's this like really pervasive sense of like loneliness and isolation.
Yeah.
And I think this is a big part of it, like why I feel passionate about ancestor work. It's like remembering like, oh my God, no, like we're literally surrounded by family, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, that is such a beautiful piece of it. I recently attended an ancestor workshop, a woman who does fire walking and things like that. She's over based in the UK and Ireland, and she took us on a journey to go meet an ancestor, and she reminded us before dropping in that like it could be a rock, it could be a feather, like it doesn't need to be a person or a body that is like a human body that shows up as that ancestor. And it is that we are so intricately interconnected. I think I'm going to touch on Sophie Strand's name again. She talks about mycelium all the time and the mycelial networks. And often when I'm doing healing work, especially if I'm doing group healing or even just receiving, I've done breath work journeys in circle before where I open my eyes and I can see the energy connections between us. And it is like mycelium on the forest floor. And it's so powerful.
Ugh. Yes, I love that. I also have this obsession with mycelium as well. Like,
Yes.
oh my gosh. Speaking of ancestors, right? Like that's like going, we can like literally trace this all back. That's why I love also like science and learning about scientific, like that using that language for magic. It helps us kind of anchor that. But like, yeah, like the fungi beings, mycelium are very early forms of life and like they just like are these great connectors, like bridges between, you know, beings. And it's, oh, like so I just like when you were talking, I was really just feeling how, you know, like mycelium, I think about this a lot in the PNW because there's huge, gorgeous forests and rainforests here and so much fungi and mycelium, and always thinking about how like the mycelium operates to feed and sustain the forest, and also like is that communication. The trees send each other messages like through it and sustain each other. I've seen this so many times and like heard beautiful stories of, you know, in logging, there'd be like trees that are logged and cut to a stump, but it actually stays alive. It grows over and stays alive because the trees around it are giving it nutrients and keeping it alive. And I just saw that when you were talking about the ways we like also do that with each other.
And that connection. Yeah. Oh my gosh. This came in and now I have to say it in case you haven't heard it or our listeners haven't. But I read a book recently, Ways of Being was the book. And they speak in it about the rainforests and the mycelium and how it's the rain in the rainforests occurs and there is so much of it, and it can kind of keep the cycle going because of the spores of a certain mushroom. And so when we cut back the rainforest, if we replant, unless we also regenerate the soil so that those mushrooms can come back, we're not just going to get rain back just because we put trees back. It's like the mushrooms make the rain. It's wild. Anyways, that's why I must share this detail far and wide because it's magic.
It's amazing. I have so many thoughts. One just being like, also like feel little you present, being like still passionate about the rainforest. And like, I think that's so beautiful and just like sweet. And also, yeah, I think it's so interesting because I think about, you know, again, so much of these seeds of then I think what grew into capitalism and these different systems, you know, and the philosophies that uphold them. Like it's so interesting because I think it's an expression of just like humans getting very wrapped up into just like their ego and their sense of being the pinnacle of consciousness, the pinnacle of creation. And this, and it's just like, it's just the more we actually do learn as a species and slash remember, again, like there's lots of complexities, but like how deeply, deeply untrue that is. Like we cannot comprehend the level of complexity of this system that is this planet. And oh my gosh, I'm just like constantly amazed as I learn about biology and about ecosystems and how they function. Like, oh my gosh, that's why one of the many reasons why I think those indigenous and ancestral lifeways around respecting the wisdom and learning to listen to these other life forms that are amongst us, you know, like it might often there's like the language of the symbolic that it is used that these beings share with us around like, I guess what's making me think about is so many stories where, you know, like white Western scientists are speaking to indigenous peoples and like also indigenous scientists, you know, in their own cultural context and trying to ask questions about the landscape. And like the people are sharing these stories and saying like, well, this is the story of this landscape. Like this is how we know what's going on with it. And it being just like totally dismissed by these Western scientists that are like, well, that's not alive. And they're just telling a story because they don't understand. It's like often that dismissal. Right. And like, then come to find out later that it's like measurably, provably true. It's just like spoken about in a symbolic, relational way.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you listen and hear the way that plants and animals and land speaks. It's like, it's not going to like tell you necessarily the like chemical constituents at play, but it will tell you the story of true, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of the disconnection that has come for humans who are enmeshed in this society is that we forgot how to listen. We forget how to be to simply be. You know, that kind of at this point almost cliched saying that goes around that you're a human being, not a human doing. But it bears repeating over and over because we don't remember how to be with each other, to be with the land, to be with the plants and the ability to hear what's not spoken in words, but is right there if we take the time to slow down and to learn a little and to be present with. There's so much wisdom there and so much relief of that sense of loneliness. Coming back to what you said, you know, that I think the disconnect, I mean, I know the disconnect is of our own making, not individually on an individual level these days, but very much it's a creation, it's a fabrication. And this is kind of making me think about some of the things I see. And I mean, being a coach, which you are as well, there's so much in the coaching world that is like very focused on the individualism piece, right? You can rise higher, you have all the control, and it really, I think, furthers some of the harmful narratives that we have going on in our society because yes, every individual is important and we need to be able to heal ourselves and prioritize our needs and come back to that piece of healing. And the journey can't be walked alone. We need the land. We need each other. We need guides. And those guides might be human and they might not be.
Yes, so true. Yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, I feel like that's the dance, right? I think that's like what spiritual paradigms and pathways really are often trying to teach and us throughout time, throughout all of human cultures is what lots of things are doing, but it's like trying to support us in exploring how do I experience myself and understand myself and fully express this container that is me, but also hold it in such a way where there's a flexibility of that and there's a permeability that we can like engage a self-concept also that is deeply interwoven with many, many different kinds of life and different forms of consciousness. And it's really like, as you were talking, I was just like, the thing that always makes me, again, feel really hopeful and like my heart feels like it swells when I just think about like, okay, the thing that's so amazing is like we are so disconnected, yes, and like it's right there, like it's still right there, and we can, I think it's, part of that listening. That's a big thing I like work with folks around, because I think that's often one of those big barriers. People are like, people who are curious, right, are seeking, and they feel the resonance of like, I want to listen, but there's often this like, but I don't know what that really means,
Yeah, I do. Like there's a gulf, it's like right there, but there's almost like a chasm, and they don't realize that it just takes, one small tree or something to cross. There is a place to cross. But if you don't know where that place is, it can be really hard to find.
Yeah, and I think so much of it too is like trusting that you have the ability, like everyone has the ability, like it's innate to our species. Like we have always talked to all these different beings, creatures, spirits. It doesn't take a special, like some people are especially skilled at those kinds of conversations, but everyone has the ability to do them. And I think the big part of it is really working on divesting from the idea that all of our perceptions are about us, and like all the thoughts that come into your mind, all the emotions that you have are like very belonging to you. And I think often what I'll talk to people about is learning how to listen is like the act of just slowing down and giving yourself spaciousness to perceive other beings, and take it a little less personally, like sitting with a tree and of course visually perceiving, but then like feeling like, what is this, what are you feeling, and opening yourself to noticing what thoughts come into your mind, noticing what feelings come into your body. Eventually, I think there's this space where the blurriness between like, oh, I'm appreciating this beautiful tree, and all of a sudden I'm feeling this certain sense of solidity and calm, and I'm feeling like, I think you can start to shift and sense like, oh, whoa, I just had this thought of some kind of clarity or some kind of information, and I'm like, oh, that was literally the tree talking.
Yeah. As you were
Oh no, it's
speaking, about the like I'm appreciating this tree, my brain went, oh yeah, and now the tree's appreciating me, right? Having that shift is what you're speaking to, is that ability to be like, there are two conscious beings here.
Yeah, it just feels really sweet, because I think that's the gift of coming back to the body too, is like we experience this information and we interpret, and we are able to have these kinds of conversations with our senses, with our nervous systems, with all these different ways that we perceive. And I think that's often why so much of the work is around healing, and like, because it's hard to be in a body.
Yes.
Yep.
It is. It is. And I think that a lot of the healing, again, kind of coming back to that space of like, heal yourself and self-care and all of these things. I feel like a lot of spaces forget to attend to the body when we start on those healing paths. It gets quite cerebral or even spiritual and out of body, even if it's not conscious cerebral. It is this like meeting parts of self, and it feels very out there often. And it can be really easy to get caught up living out there and forgetting to attend to the needs of our animal bodies, of our soft human flesh that we find ourselves in. So there is that wisdom from nature as well. That connection to the physical is just as important as the connection to the spiritual.
Absolutely. It's something also I feel like an overall paradigm I feel really passionate about is, I mean, also as a queer person and a non-binary person, it's really central to my altar. And so it's like, I think of it often in those ways, but also just like I think that's also part of what spirituality assists us in, is again, like divesting from these like overly binary or overly polarized senses of reality, and like seeing that there is something being expressed through what is in form and what is formless, but that like things in form, bodies, earth it's the same, it's made up of the same stuff as things that are out of form. And I think that's a big wound, actually, like in our sort of modern human psyche, is this idea that like we have to leave the body and leave the earth in order to have a spiritual experience. And so much of that remembering piece is like the most transcendent, and metaphysical experiences can also be experienced through and within form and body and being here. And like there is no, like one is not better than the other, and they in fact like are so needed for each other to have, you know, it's beautiful to have like very celestial cosmic experiences, but also like we can have those here on earth too.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you said there, that whole sense of that wound of not being connected here. It's it makes me think a little bit again. Sophie Strand, apparently she's the strand that's connecting
Love
my
it.
thoughts today. But she talks about Christianity and how it divorced God from the earth. It is the only, or the first religion, I won't say the only because they're descendants of that religion, but where God suddenly wasn't of the earth. He didn't walk on the earth. His son did for a bit, but then he wasn't even allowed to go back to the earth at the end of his life. He had to disappear and go up into the sky. And so that sense of disconnect from this living earth and the bodies that give life too, this tying back into bodies on the earth, and that disconnect that we get there, where it becomes this very rational, mental, scientific is the only way to kind of understand, instead of remembering some of those more felt sense, embodied, softer. I just talked on my podcast before about, the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, not in the binaries of sex, but in the qualities that those two words represent. And we've lost a lot of that connection to the kind of earthy, dark, sacred, life-giving side of creation, with that disconnect and that divorce, leaving that wound.
Yeah, I think so much of the like Christian concepts of, I mean, sin dwelling in the body and in earth, and like earth and body as sort of like punishments and things that we endure in order to like get to the cerebral. I think, also why those, I mean, it really, that kind of concept, I think, is the seed that really does form so much of the subjugation of, like women and femmes and queer people, trans people who like embody aspects of creation that really flout the like ideas of like the sacred being somewhere else. I mean, I think all life does that, but I think like throughout many human cultures, like specifically like women, femmes, and queer folks, trans folks were always, they were really respected for their closeness to that representation of divinity in a body where there is that capacity to give life and hold life, and also to create life and create self. And I think that like very creative aspect, I think it dwells within all gender expressions, and of course also within cis het men as well, are there a very creative force. But I think like there's that capacity of like being really connected to body and blood and those qualities of liminality that typically have not always cross-culturally been associated with cishet men. And I think like that in like Christianity, it's like a consciousness or like a spiritual paradigm that's so linear, and it really reveres that which is like pure and clean and straightforward, and the body and the earth is not like that,
No.
and many people, I mean, no one really is like that, but certainly not queer and trans folks, and women and femmes often can't really like be forced into those kinds of linear ways of
they can't even
as,
hope to attempt to attain it. By
yes,
nature,
and
they will
it's
never
like
be.
very complex.
Yeah, very,
Yes,
very
totally.
complex. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think that perhaps I have written down here one of the topics that you wanted to touch on was the work of the modern witch. And I feel like that's kind of what we've been talking about, right? That work
Mm,
is to bring this consciousness back and to help folks remember.
really. Yeah, I think like, I think there's like so many roles, and there's not like one definition, but like I often think of the work of the modern witch as like a lot of this reweaving and asking questions and being critical of what it is that we were taught, and being critical of systems and seeking something. I always think about like the word radical, it means the root, and like trying to get to the root, being critical of what we were taught is true, and asking a lot of questions. Like, to me, that's kind of the epitome of the modern witch, is someone who stewards good question asking and good listening, and continues to peel back these layers and ask, like, where did this come from? What is its source? I think that question feels so important in my craft, and when I'm trying to work with folks of this idea, like really asking ourselves, if we are this amalgam of all this ancestral energy, right? Good, bad, and in between. If we want to be a channel for something, if we feel passionate about healing, about this remembering work, then we need to be really mindful and thoughtful about what moves through us. And a lot of that is that just like going back and asking, like, wait, why do I think this thing? Or how have I come to be this way? And sometimes the answer goes thousands of years back,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Being okay sitting with the discomfort of being wrong or being corrected or relearning behaviors and the way we speak and the things that we do and say. It's not comfortable, but it's so powerful to be able to do and to be able to model for others as well.
Yeah, like what that made me think of was, the witch has always had this connection to the dirt and the blood and things that maybe like over cultural society or normative society thinks is scary or ugly or gross or whatever. The witch tends those spaces and places. And I think that is so vital in this modern resurgence of the witch, is like really being willing to be in that messiness and in the muck and bring awareness to these pieces, both within ourselves and amongst ourselves. I think like only really through coming into presence, right? Which is another way of naming that, like coming into presence, embodiment, can we move forward and build these futures. And I think that's why like the witch to me really represents this like truth seeking and truth tending,
Yeah. Yeah. It's beautiful work. And I feel like we could talk for so long. But I will wrap us. That feels like a beautiful place too, to kind of wrap with that idea of the witch as a truth seeker and a truth sharer and a safe space to uncover those truths and hold them and take a peek at them in the light of day. For folks who are interested in learning a bit more about you or working with you, what do you have coming up to offer people?
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you. Yeah. I'm most like active, if people want to stay connected, is on Instagram at Tending the Mystery. And I will be gearing up to open registration for Rune School, which is like one of my big class offerings that I love so much. And it's this kind of amalgam of ancestral craft. Like a lot of my ancestors come from Scandinavia. And I work with the Elder Futhark runes, which is an ancient proto-language. And so I walk folks through a year of sitting with and being with these runes and learning about them and using that for their own journey and like using this ancestral transmission to heal and grow. Registration opens in May and is such a beautiful container. And I also have like other witchcraft mentorship opportunities and stuff that I share on there. But yeah, I think that's probably, and my website is tendingthemystery.com.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you. And all of these links for people listening will be in the show notes down below. So you don't have to write while you're driving or anything. If you're listening in the car, you'll be able to find Espen. And I would highly recommend you checking them out. Their courses are on my wish list. And it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. So thank you so, so much for taking the time out of your day to sit and chat with me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a beautiful conversation. Yeah, I'm super grateful.
My pleasure. And Woo Crew, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions for Espen or for me, come find us over on Instagram as always. And next week I will be back with a solo episode for you. If you enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and leave a 5-star review wherever you are listening. And I can't wait to drop into your ears next week. Bye for now.